All right, so you should have on your tables the handouts there. You can pass those around. Hopefully they're enough, and maybe we can spread them around. And I've got some from last week if you need those. We're taking a little more time. Where this week and last week we're just in Revelation chapter 13, because this is the section of the book where we're really getting into, okay, what are these evil powers that are working against us, against God's people? Right, because it's called Revelation. The whole point is it's not making predictions so much as it's revealing, here's what's going on. It's pulling back the curtain, as we see here, to show, okay, here's what's at work, right? First, we start with, we see God at work, but now we need to know what we're up against, in a sense. And so we're kind of introduced to this, you can call it the unholy trinity of the dragon, which is John's image, a symbol for Satan. Then you have the first beast that we talked about last week. And today we're getting either, it's called the second beast, right? One comes from the sea, one comes from the land. And the second beast is also called the false prophet sometimes. And, as I mentioned last time, it's not so much like, okay, so which human leader now or in the future is this talking about? It's anchored in their time and their place, right? This was a letter written to 7 churches. So the Roman Empire is the big bad at the time, right? So you've got to have that in mind. And yet to see that it can apply more than that. Any human leader or nation can become beastly, right? So it's describing a pattern more than a person. And so the question is not who is the beast, it's who is acting beastly, right? Maybe at this moment. And what we saw last week in the first part of chapter 13 is that it's hard to resist, right? It's this idea of being taken captive. I think it's more this letting your thoughts be taken captive, as Colossians talk about. That's what we as God's people who know the way of the Lamb, what we're always trying to resist, but to not worship any other power or authority. So, like I said, this time we're getting into this second beast and these ideas of the number of the beast and the mark of the beast, right? If people don't know anything else about Revelation, those are concepts that they've probably heard of and have some thoughts about. So I want you to start, just talk at your tables. I guess, Stephen, you can join another table. And just talk about what are some of the craziest theories that you've heard or most interesting, right? Whether you believe it or not is not the issue, but what are some of the things that are out there about the number of the beast, the 666, what that means, or the mark of the beast that we're going to talk about? And then maybe talk about how could you either prove or disprove that, right? Is there a way to show like, well, this is how I know this is the truth, right? What are some ideas that are out there? So talk about that at your tables, then we'll take a second and see what people came up with. All right, well, let's bring it back in. Just can I get a couple people from your table? What was something that you heard that like, well, I never heard of that one before, or if there were kind of a lot of people are saying the same thing. What were some of the suggestions, ideas? Anyone want to share?
No.
Yeah, Lynn.
Too wild.
Well, what we were talking about is that one of my favorite authors is Robert Heinlein, who writes science fiction books. In one of his books, he talked about the number of the beast being not the number 666, which is tangible. We can put 666 M&Ms in a bowl on our table and see what that number represents. But he said that actually it was the number 6 raised to the 6th power, which gives you a number in the quadrillions.
Okay, so we're getting into the math here, right? Yeah. Okay, not my area of expertise, but okay, so it's...
Because 6 to the 6th power is 46,656, which is already a number that we can't put our heads around.
Okay, so maybe, yeah, it's
so if you multiply that times itself 6 times.
Okay. Yeah, so even just what you do with those numbers beyond what a person or anything, like you could go a lot of different directions.
So
that's
when
one.
When I think about the number of the beast, it's not small to me. It's legion. The evil, that evil, those evil actions. It's actually living
exponential
in every one of us, and that exponential number is so huge that we can't fathom it.
Okay.
And that's
there's all right. So there's one idea. Any others? totally different direction? You've heard? We'll talk about some as we get to it, but I just, yeah. I couldn't tell that Gail, you were raising your hand.
Well, I just mentioned that I've heard people say that www that you log in on the internet is.
Okay. I don't know if I'd heard that one. That's good. Yeah. So it's just, yeah, anytime you get 3 repeating, you can try and tie it into things. So yeah, I did not go on the internet to see what everybody say, which I think was probably a wise idea, but there's a lot out there. And like I said,
I remember
mention more,
back
so.
in the 70s and 80s, before all this technology came about, and I think it was even before we had the barcodes on the food that we scanned.
Mm-hmm.
Remember
Yeah,
that?
I've heard. Yep.
And so
barcodes.
they all got so, I don't know, weird about it. And so they're like, oh, when that time comes at the end of times,
we're gonna have to have barcodes,
yes.
right? Yep. I've heard that one quite a bit. Yeah. All right. Well, like I said, we'll get to that more of that in just a second. We're really only looking at verses 11 to 18 today, but there's a lot we're going to get into. So I'm going to read it to start, and then we'll kind of pick apart different things as we go. So chapter 13, starting in verse 11. Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath or spirit to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. All right, so again, I mean, this is Revelation, right? This the same language, the image of the beast over and over, and it seems so strange. So we're going to try and sort out what is this pointing us to, and how is this relevant in our lives today. So you see it called here the second beast from the earth. I'm going to refer to this as the false prophet. That's a name that it's also given in a few other places, chapter 19, verse 20, just for clarity, right? So you have the beast and the false prophet and the dragon. And again, we see this as kind of an inversion of the Holy Trinity, just as the Holy Spirit inspires us to call Jesus Lord and inspires prophecy. In a similar way, this false prophet inspires worship of the beast, who's kind of like the Christ figure, although not called the Antichrist in Revelation, kind of similar. So again, we start with what it meant for John's first audience, and then we can see what it can mean for us. Like I said, the beast seems somehow to refer to the Roman Empire. And the heads on the beast are probably talking about specific emperors or Caesars. And we saw last time there's probably a reference to the Emperor Nero, who was the emperor in the 60s. He died by suicide because he stabbed himself in the head, which is probably when it talks about this, the one who was wounded in the head. That's probably a reference to him, because there was a rumor that he didn't actually die, he survived, and he was going to come back at a later time and take power again. And so the beast is somehow Rome's power represented through the Caesars or the emperors. And so if that's what this first beast is, right, that's talking about the empire, especially its leaders. The false prophet is what is calling people, forcing people to give worship or undue allegiance to the emperors. So it's like the imperial cult, right? This was a part of their society, is you offered sacrifices on behalf of the emperor or even to the emperor. And that wasn't, the way we divide out religious and political stuff, it was mixed together in a very different way for them. And so doing this religious act, offering an animal sacrifice for Caesar, was seen as a political thing to do, right? And so when people like Christians wouldn't offer that political sacrifice, that was seen as, not well, really unpatriotic, right? You're not supporting the empire. And if a certain group in our empire is not doing what they need to do to appease the gods, then that's going to bring trouble on us. And that's a big reason why Christians in the empire, the Roman Empire, faced so much persecution. It wasn't just that they didn't follow the religion, it's that by not following the religion, they were also putting the nation, the empire, at risk. Interesting enough, Christians were called atheists in this time because they didn't do these sacrifices to the gods, right? That was just what you did. That was religion in their time. And so it didn't matter that Christians said they believed in God. Since they didn't do those actions, they were considered atheists. And that was detrimental to the entire empire. And so this cult is about getting people to, in John's language, worship the beast, right? Do those kind of sacrifices. And there would be images of Caesar, right? The idols, we would call them. These pagan priests, they could make it seem like those images did have power, right? It's all just smoke and mirrors, probably literally. It makes me think of like Wizard of Oz, right? The great and powerful, right? There's nothing really there. There's nothing behind the curtain, but these priests could make it seem like those statues or idols or images had power. And that would inspire people to think, well, I guess I better do my sacrificing because, I don't want Zeus or whoever it is to come after me. So I think that's what he's talking about there when he's saying it could make them perform great signs to deceive people, right? It's trying to make it seem like Caesar or Apollo or whoever has all this sort of power. And John is calling us to see, no, that's all fake, right? They're just trying to deceive you there. And so then he gets into the number of the beast, right? We see it at the end. We're jumping around a little bit here, but we're trying to figure out, okay, what is this talking about? And this is one place where I think you can make the argument that John is giving a little bit more of a code than just a symbol, right? This is something I know I talked about in the introduction, but for those that weren't here or those that can't remember everything that I say, there's the difference between a code and a symbol is that a code is kind of one for one, right? This equals that, and you just have to figure out how to decipher that code. Whereas a symbol can often mean more than one thing. It may be tied to something literal, but it means more than that. But I mean, he says it pretty clearly in that last verse 18 there, right? It is the number of a person, right? You can calculate it if you have wisdom. And so I think he is trying to talk about someone specific here. And just as a reminder, about the general way that numbers work, I meant to print off, I think I have a handout on what numbers tend to symbolize and what colors tend to symbolize. I'll have some of those next week if people want them. But as we've seen before, right, 7 represents completeness, holiness, right? It's often associated with God, the 7 churches, the 7 spirits. And so 6 is one off of 7, right? So it's incomplete or even evil somehow. And then the number 3 can also symbolize completeness, the Trinity, plenty of other places we see that show up here. And so I think one way to understand 666 is it's complete evil, right? 3 is completeness, 6 is evil, 3 6s is complete evil. So that's possibly a way that number functions there. And then getting into, okay, but does it mean anything more? A lot of people have pointed to a Hebrew practice called gematria. So in the ancient world, in ancient languages, most did not have like written numbers, right? Like the number 1, number 2. They used letters to represent numbers, right? Roman numerals, for example. Those worked a little different where you have to know V is 5, and that sort of thing. But in a lot of languages, including Hebrew, you just go by the alphabet. So it'd be like we said, A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, right? It's a very simple code. And so here you have the Hebrew alphabet. It's on the back of your handout as well if you can't see all of this. So if you want to learn Hebrew, here's your chance to learn your Hebrew alphabet. I don't know an alphabet song for it like we have, unfortunately. But if you go on this chart, you can see you have kind of the ones column, the tens, and then the hundreds column. And so what you can do with this is you can take a name and you can get a numerical value for it. Right, so take, for example, a Hebrew name like Hannah. That would be a het right here. Hold on, noon, which is right here, and a hey, which is right there. They have two H's. It's a very different kind of way of going through it. And so if you start with a name, it's pretty easy to get the number, right? So if you took that example, het, noon, hey, that's 8 plus 50 plus 5, that's 63. All right, so that's not too hard to do. But if you start with a number, that's a little trickier because you could combine any number of letters to get the number 63 like we just did. All right, so if you have the name first, you can figure out what the number would be. But if you start with the number, that's complicated. But, and what makes it hard is that we just have the number here in Revelation. And so that's what has led over, the years, over the centuries, for people to say all sorts of things about, well, here's who I think. You can add their name up and it gets 666, but they're, probably not using Hebrew. So you don't start with Obama or Trump or whoever it is, right? We want to try and start with, okay, what would it mean in their time? Who might John refer to as a completely evil emperor? And the name that we've already mentioned before is most likely Nero. Nero Caesar, as they would say it. And just to point out, Hebrew, if you were wondering in that, why weren't there vowels? Hebrew didn't have written vowels. It was just consonants and a couple letters that would be spaces sometimes. And so it's probably likely, because he's already made some, hidden kind of oblique references to him, that he's talking about Nero. So he's writing about 30 years after Nero's time in the 90s. So if we're using this same practice here, you would write out Neron Caesar is how they would put it. And again, he's using Hebrew, even though he's writing in Greek, because John is Jewish, and it seems that he's writing to a lot of Jewish Christians. And so that's why they would use Hebrew instead of Greek. And so you can just kind of go through I'll use our English letters, the N, R, W, N, Q, S, R. And those are the different numbers you get: 50, 200, 6, 50, 160 plus 200 equals 666. And one of the other clues that this might be who he's thinking of, there are some manuscripts that drop this second N here. So it's just Nero Caesar. And if you drop that, it would be 616. We have some manuscripts where it reads 616 instead of 666. So, and again, why would Nero be the one that he would be talking about, even though it was in the past? Well, I think in their mind, it's kind of equivalent to how we talk about Hitler today, right? Nero burned Rome. Nero was the emperor when Peter and Paul were killed. So if any one person is going to loom large in the Christian memory of someone who's evil and persecuted the church, that's who you would go to. And they're probably, if they're under the Emperor Domitian at this time, they're probably experiencing something similar. So it kind of feels like, okay, we're going through this again. So in the same way, if we said today, and it's just like Hitler all over again, we're not saying that Hitler literally came back from the dead. We're saying this person seems to be acting like this other person in history. And so that's why he's bringing up Nero here. So again, it's not about predicting and figuring out, okay, if we can figure out what name now aligns with this, then we'll know who the beast is. It's saying, it is still a reminder that we be watchful for earthly leaders who claim divine blessing or divine authority to do things that go against the way of God. So it is still a reminder, pay attention to how leaders are leading. But this in particular, I think, is one place where we really focus on what did it mean for them, and that's what's most important. Otherwise, we go in some weird directions. All right, any questions about this number of the beast? I know that was a lot. Hopefully, there's enough on your handout to make that clear. Yeah, Don.
Who started this?
Yeah, this was a practice in the first century and earlier that.
Who actually started it? Who thought it up?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when the practice began. Like I said, in Hebrew, they didn't have numbers. And so even in like the Old Testament, you would, if you needed to say 3 or something, it would just use the gimel there.
And the letters that are not up there in our alphabet, they did not use those letters at that time?
Right, yeah, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about the difference in the Hebrew alphabet and English alphabet. So they have, 2 or 3 letters for S. It's just kind of a different way of doing things. They didn't have written vowels, although there is a way of marking that. So it's, yeah, this is just kind of how the language worked. And yeah, I probably should have done more research on exactly when they started this gematria practice, but we know even from scripture that numbers had to function, or letters had to function as numbers because they didn't have written numbers.
So this is something that John wrote about.
Mhm.
Was somebody else actually. This is not something that John.
Well, I would think that's it. You know, again, he's not writing in Hebrew, but he knows Hebrew as a Jew, and so he probably, if this is what it's meant to represent, then that's intentional on his part. That yeah, he knew about this. So again, we can't say 100% for certain because he doesn't come out and say, I'm going to give you a code according to this, but this is a pretty common understanding of this is how we got there.
666 relating to Nero then?
Yeah, I think that's what he's trying to say again, because he talked about the wounded head is a pretty clear reference to him, and we may see some others as well. So that additional clues. Like I said, we want to start with what he could have been talking about. It could be something else, right? But this is.
To do with Satan or anything like that?
I mean, again, if 6 represents evil, I think he's trying to, and this is again one of the big themes of 12 and 13 is that the power behind the beast is the dragon, right? So Satan is working behind this. The Roman Empire is not all the evil that there is, but it is, it is significant because it's empowered by the dragon, by Satan. All right, yeah.
How did you get Hannah? Why did you do the CH as the first?
Because that's just how it's spelled in Hebrew.
Okay,
Yeah, and you could pick other names. David would be like Dalet, Vav, Dalet. All right, so that's just kind of how Hebrew works. All right, well, let's move on because we still have the mark of the beast to talk about, the other very interesting part of this. Oh, let someone in. All right, so the mark of the beast here, again, lots of different theories out there, barcodes, microchips, now the vaccines. If you follow me on social media, I kind of had a post joking about that. Again, why I don't think we start there with those interpretations is that would make no sense to the original audience in the first century, right? What's a barcode? What's a microchip? Now, again, we'll see how this does become relevant to us, but it's got to start with them. And so if it's just completely nonsense in the first century, that probably shouldn't be our starting place. Instead, we want to start with, well, what was their context, right? Especially a lot of Jewish Christians. And see this pattern of everything that the beast or the false prophet does or the dragon does is a perversion of what God does, right? Satan can't create anything. All it can do is twist what God has made. And so as it talks about this beast that's on the hand and the forehead, many see this as a reference to the Hebrew prayer called the Shema, which is just Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 8. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone. And you see there that last verse there, Moses is talking about, it says, bind it as a sign on your hand and fix it as an emblem on your forehead, right? Which even there, it's not so much, we do know that Pharisees in the first century actually had little boxes of scripture they would wear on their forehead and on their wrists sometimes. But even there, it's probably more a reference to everything you do with your hand and everything that you think should be related to God and the love that God has for us. And so the mark of the beast is just twisting this mark here. And it's also, this idea of being marked with something. We've seen this idea of being sealed already in Revelation, so it might be a reference to that as well. It's, again, a flip side of it. And it's kind of John's way of saying you have to pick a side, right? You're going to be marked either as belonging to the Lamb or marked as belonging to the beast and on their side. John doesn't really leave room for in between. That's not how Revelation tends to work. And so how does this work out? What does it do? I think the key reference here is in verse 17, where it says that if you don't have it, you can't buy or sell. And so we're seeing here it's some sort of economic pressure. You're not able to function and do business in the empire or whenever if you don't have this in some way. And we know first century Christians couldn't engage in certain business practices. Eating meat sacrificed to an idol, that was a big deal. We see it in 1 Corinthians And it's already come up in those letters to the 7 churches. That's mentioned more than once. And that's a way of, saying you shouldn't be able to participate in this. Or if you're going to participate in this, you're kind of giving in to other powers that you may not be aware of. And so for us, refusing to take the mark of the beast is when we will not give in to certain business practices or participate in certain economic ways of doing things, which I know is less exciting than conspiracy theories about being branded, but I think it's important to not get too caught up in what seems more exciting. I mean, so what are, as you think through history or even today, what are some sort of beastly, unjust economic practices, ways of using money that hurt people or are ungodly? What's something that comes to mind?
The monopolies of these corporations running these small businesses.
Okay. Yeah, so monopolies, right? It all just kind of goes to one place, and they can kind of do whatever they want, and little people get squashed, right? Okay. Gambling. Okay, yeah. You're promised. The way I've heard it before is that it's like a tax on people that are bad at math, especially like lottery tickets, right? So it ends up being abusive, right? And people think that if I engage in this, I can get rich. Huh?
Well, we just had an example this week of the death of Bernie Madoff, and how one person can manipulate the system.
Yeah.
To his advantage.
Yeah, Bernie Madoff, right? He manipulates the system. He's able to get rich and hurts a lot of people with that. There's also things like, slavery, right? That's not as pressing a concern today, but I mean, you literally are buying and selling human beings for your own profit. That was going on in the first century, and Christians were struggling with how to deal with it, and Christians through history have tried to deal with that. Or maybe it's smaller things like just cheating on your taxes, right? Like, maybe I don't need to say that I earned this much or something like that, right? That's giving that deceit. Lying is a big deal in Revelation. So those kind of practices still feed into this. We're using our money the world's way instead of using our resources in a godly way, or even the way that we outsource things, right? I mean, again, I don't want to get into a big economic discussion, but things are made for pennies abroad and then sold for hundreds over here.
I don't think this is economic at all.
Okay.
I mean, obviously there's an economy in regards to buying and selling, but that's not what the beast is doing. The beast is not saying, hey, you have to charge 5% interest or you're on my side. That doesn't come into it, I don't think. I'm seeing this as and we've seen examples of this throughout history, where certain groups of people are labeled. And all right, you mentioned slavery. Well, how are you eligible to be a slave? Well, there were some ways to do it, but the simple was, that guy's skin color is different, therefore he's eligible to be a slave.
Yeah.
He's got the mark.
Okay. Yeah,
he's not white, therefore he's not part of us.
Yeah. Okay.
That goes on in more recent history. I mean, the Nazis, if you didn't put on your little swastika band, you're not going to be a part of the club now, are you? You have to agree with us, join our cause, whether you agree with it or not, or we're pushing you out. Even today, we see this in China in particular. Whether you're in the church or not, they don't care if you're in the church as long as you subscribe to the party and you do what the party says and you go along with what the party does.
Yeah.
So I don't think this is a commentary on economic practice. I think this is a commentary on people who are trying to force others to do their will instead of what those people maybe know is right. And going back to the Roman Empire, the Romans actually would have been very proud of how tolerant they were. If we let everybody do worship anybody, just as long as they pay homage to the emperor.
Right.
And that was the one thing the Christians said we won't do.
Yeah. So and I mean, I don't think those are necessarily mutually exclusive, right? I mean, the way that you show you're part of a group is how you support with your money, right? And Jesus talked about money so much of where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so whether it's just about that, or I mean, I think both can apply, right? And sometimes there literally are marks that you have to wear.
I don't disagree that there's a right way to do business and a wrong way to do business. I just don't think this passage is dealing with that area.
Sure. I mean, again, Revelation is definitely a book that's open to more than one interpretation. So yeah, I appreciate another perspective, right? There's plenty of ways that these other powers are going to try and make us show that we're on their side, whether it's how we spend our money, whether we wear a certain patch or dress a certain way. The point is that he's helping us to see, be aware with where this is coming from, right? You see it at the very beginning. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try and wrap this up. That, you know, the beast doesn't appear beastly, right? It looks like a lamb, but it talks like a dragon. And so this is what we have to pay attention to as followers of the Lamb. Where is this a different voice, right? Where is this something seen? It's propaganda, right? It's calling evil good, calling violence peace, right? That's something the Roman Empire talked about, is the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It's peace by violence. And so to make sure we're not buying into that way of thinking, and see that behind all this, like I said, is the dragon. It's not just that, as Paul says, our battle is not against flesh and blood. The problem is not just those leaders, and we get rid of those leaders and everything will be fine. That has never worked through history. It's seeing there's something bigger going on, and that battle is happening in big and small ways each and every day. So hopefully we can pay a little more attention to it. All right, well, everybody else is trying to leave, so I'll let you all out as well. Thanks for your comments, and we'll see you next time.